Hey everyone, today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at some of the policies that governments can pursue to help facilitate economic growth. Last time we talked a little bit about what creates economic growth, and we said it was productivity that increases economic growth. And we can get productivity by increasing our spending on human capital, physical capital, and technology. And we identified that the faster the rate of change, the greater the growth an economy can produce. We talked about changes in human capital and how useful it can be. The more educated your society is, the more efficient your workers can be and the more productive your economy will be. So if you look at data, for example, comparing Latin America to East Asia, you can see that in 1960, Latin America had a slightly more educated population than the East Asian countries did. However, by 2000, they were at a comparable footing, or actually in some cases a little bit better in East Asia when it came to the level of the population with education at high school or above. And it should not be a surprise then that if you look at economic growth patterns, that East Asian countries had stronger economic growth by 2000 compared to Latin America. Why? In part because they had invested strongly in human capital. Changes in physical capital makes a difference. That when you're investing in machinery and in equipment, that helps drive growth. And so when you look at capital investment as a percentage of GDP, you see, for example, China versus the United States. China spends nearly twice as much of its GDP towards capital investment than the United States does. And accordingly, you'll see changes in real GDP are much significantly higher in China than they are in the United States. Nearly 3 times as much in China as in the US. So investments in physical capital are very, very important to increasing productivity and driving economic growth. But you can't just do it for free. It's not that easy necessarily. There is a role here to be played. What role does savings have in the country's ability to invest in physical capital? Well, if you don't save, you don't invest. Remember the savings investment identity from Unit 3, Day 1. We talk about how investment is done by businesses. Businesses will tend to invest through the loan-making process, through borrowing. And borrowing only occurs when there's money in the banks. And banks only have money because people choose to save. So the more savings a country has, the more loanable funds are available, the relatively lower interest rates there are available, and accordingly, the more investment is done by businesses. And so it's very important to have not only a stable banking system, but encouraging savings and investment, because it allows businesses to increase the productivity, which then enriches the entire economy. Changes in technology are driven by investment. They're driven by research and development. And so the more research and development that is pursued, presumably the more productivity you'll begin to see in your economy. And so again, this idea of savings equals investment and the role of savings in building loanable funds for businesses to borrow is a pretty important concept. So then the question is, what role can governments play in helping encourage growth? Because at least in most free societies, most free economies, the government's not making stuff. The government's making rules that determine what can be made and in what form and in what processes. So what can the government do to help make sure that the private sector is creating the kind of productivity gains that lead to economic growth? Well, one of the most important things the government can do is provide for the infrastructure that runs the economy, the roads, the airports, the ports, the railways, the energy grid, the utilities. These are all things that the government is able to provide, in part because a lot of these are natural monopolies, and they're just such massive upfront costs to building these things that government often will step in and provide these for the economy to run. If you have poor infrastructure, how might that impact your economic growth? Well, I mean, if your roads are not sustainable, if you don't have the ability to do high-speed transportation of goods and services, it takes a long time to get things from manufacture to point of sale, and that really slows the rate of growth in your economy. If you don't have reliable electricity, for example, which you don't see in a lot of countries, you can't consistently and reliably produce the products, goods, and services that people want. So having strong, reliable physical infrastructure is essential to an economy's functioning. The government can also spend some time and money investing in various technologies that are emerging through research and development. Most research and development is done through the private sector. One of the nice things about the private sector research and development process is that investors are looking for those technologies that are likely to win, and those that do get money and those that don't. The government isn't always as efficient at figuring out what the next great new innovation is going to be, but they do have a lot of resources available to spreading out money to see what might stick. So things like green energy research, for example, might be something the government can put money towards, or NASA, which is one of the engines of technological improvement over the last 50, 60, 70 years. A lot of everyday products come now as a result of the research and development done by NASA. So government has some role to play here in encouraging and facilitating research and development. Human capital is another thing governments can pursue, and this is where the debate in recent years has been quite interesting as we discuss what is in fact infrastructure. Is it just roads, bridges, and electric grids, or is it sort of softer concepts like education and healthcare? And different people make different arguments. But whether you see this as infrastructure or not, it's irrelevant. The point is that government supports primary and secondary schools, as an example, and helps ensure an educated population. So the more educated your population is, the more skills they presumably possess, and the more productive they can be in the workplace. And similarly with things like healthcare, having a functioning system of healthcare which enables people to get healthy when they're sick and return quickly back to work is an important tool towards economic growth for certain. Another lens we can look at for what the government can do comes with the prompt, would you rather build a new factory in Ireland or Syria? If you're a business and you're looking to expand your operations, would you rather be expanding in a country like Ireland or a country like Syria? And the answer is that most people would say they'd rather go to Ireland, because Ireland tends to be a lot more stable and reliable. It's not in the midst of a civil war. And Syria, for example, has been ripped apart over the last decade with civil war and conflict. If you had to choose, you'd probably want to avoid the area with a lot of conflict. Or take another example. Would you want to invest in a country like Venezuela? A country that's rich in resources and has a history of hardworking, successful economic systems up until recently, I suppose, with the Maduro government and Chavez. And now, of course, most people would say they would probably not want to invest in Venezuela, not because it's a bad culture or society, but because the country has a huge potential for civil war and a lot of unrest politically. The government arbitrarily seizes private property from people, and there is rampant government corruption. These are all three things that are not helpful if you're looking to grow your economy. It turns out that government stability is one of the most important aspects of economic growth. The more politically stable and socially stable a country is, the more likely it is that its economy will be able to grow. So government's ability to create a business-friendly climate in which there is economic freedom for people to pursue their interests will lead to more economic growth. And we have statistics that sort of bear that out. If you look at the graph, you'll see that as countries become more economically free, they tend to also be more prosperous. And it's a pretty direct trend or correlation, to be sure. Or you can look at this and say the level of economic freedom tends to be correlated with GDP per capita, that the more economically free a country is, we generally see higher GDP per capita. So government's ability to be free of corruption and to enable people to pursue their interests will help an economy grow much faster than if you're in a more controlled or authoritarian system. And like we said in the previous video, when you're talking about production possibilities curve, point C is efficient. You can't have more of one without less of another. And while that's okay, we'd probably prefer A. A is more of both goods. But in order to get to A, we need sustained long-run growth. to make that possible. And so growth is important because we could get to A short term, I suppose, if we were in an inflationary gap. We could make people work overtime or something like that. But long term, we can't stay at A unless we see actual economic growth. And so we got to keep in mind the difference between growth and output fluctuations. When you shift aggregate demand, you see fluctuations in output. Yes, output increases in the short run, but eventually adjusts back to the long run. We want to make sure that when we're seeing increases in output, it's being driven by the supply side of the economy, that it's being driven by an increase in the long run productive ability of the economy itself. So we want to see the long run aggregate supply curve shifting right as much as possible, because it's going to set a new standard or a new marker for potential output. And as that potential output is growing, we're seeing an increase in productivity, we're seeing an increase in GDP. Visually, we can see the difference between growth and fluctuations, because we can say, well, if we're going to shift aggregate demand to the left, we'll say we're starting at long-run equilibrium, and now the government steps in and does expansionary fiscal policy, let's say. In the short run, we see an increase in price level, but also an increase in output level. But as you recall from Unit 2, we said in a situation like this, unemployment has dropped below the full employment level, and wages are going to begin to rise. And as wages rise, short-run aggregate supply curve will eventually shift back, and we end up right back where we were before at the previous potential output. So long run, no growth. But when there's an increase from the supply side, what we begin to see is a shift to the right in the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is going to increase output but have a slightly lower price level. And as that short-run aggregate supply increase becomes permanent, we see a long-run aggregate supply curve shift as well. And now there's no shifting away from this new increased output, because that's the new potential output. That's the new home for where the economy will want to adjust back to if, in fact, there is some sort of output gap. So again, real sustained permanent growth only occurs from the supply side as the economy becomes more productive. Demand side increases are only temporary and represent a fluctuation. We'll talk more about the difference between those two. We'll talk more about some of these policies that government might want to pursue to encourage growth in class, and I will see you then.